Thank you, Don, for coming again to the Fort Kent Historical Society. This is an exhibit we did it in 2017 for the 100th anniversary of having a theater here in Fort Kent. And the theater, the story of the theater, of course, starts out with this first photo. This is the Eagle Hotel, which was built in 1845, and the exact spot is where our post office is now. And in 1904, a local civic group by the name of the Modern Woodsman of America. The Modern Woodsmen of America were similar, like the Knights of Columbus or Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste. They were for Protestant people, however. It was an insurance program for Protestant people. And they purchased, in 1904, they purchased the old barns behind the Eagle Hotel, and they moved the barn to Hall Street, and they created what they called the Woodsman Hall Company, which the Woodsman Hall was our town hall. It was literally a place where there were weddings, wedding receptions, there were basketball games, there were plays, there were just gatherings of people. And when our church burnt in 1907, the parish used that hall as a temporary church until our temporary chapel, the convent, was built in 1907. And this is the building that I was talking about, the barn that was moved there. And you can obviously see it's got the roof style of a barn. This is during the flood of 1923. And again, the theater had started in 1917 by this Woodsman of America group. The first movie they shown was called Birth of a Nation, which ironically was also the first movie shown at the White House. However, it was a very racist movie. The movie was about the Ku Klux Klan, which makes great sense since the early, before the 1920s, before World War I, the state of Maine did have the Ku Klux Klan in the state. And so that does make sense that they would have that movie brought here. So that was in 1917, the first movie. Now, we always assumed that the theater in 1917, when they opened, was called the Savoy, like it was later on. However, we've recently learned, and we've recently got a poster from a movie that was shown at that theater in 1918. It was a movie about World War I, and it was called Draft 258. Unfortunately, I looked up the movie, and the movie has been lost. They do not have, they just have a few still shots of the movie. And what this poster was donated by Joey and Andrea Willett from town here, and they live on Pleasant Street, and they found that in the wall of their house. And what was very interesting, and the reason we had to rewrite the history on our theater exhibit, was we learned that the theater was not called the Savoy, but it was called the Gem. So from 1917 to 1920, the name of the theater was the Gem. And the Woodsman Hall Company sold the theater to a conglomerate of Aroostook County theaters, and they're the ones in 1920, they called it the Savoy. They renamed it the Savoy. So starting, it was the Gem, and then the Savoy, and then the Century Theater eventually. So this here is a photograph, Don, of a play that had happened inside. It's a very poor photograph, but you can see there was a stage, and there was tin ceilings, and so they had a stage there. And this is part of the Fort Kent Athletic Association of 1919. They were a semi-professional basketball team, and their home court was the Savoy Theatre. So they used the theater as a basketball court until the theater came on full-time, until they were sold in the 1920s. We actually know all of them, but off the top of my head, this is Jim Hoyt. So, and I'd like to point out this down here. This is the original ticket collector from the Savoy Theatre. And it was recently donated to us by Ben Parody and family, who are the last owners of the theater, who have just recently sold out to somebody else. This is the original candy counter that was in the Savoy Theatre, probably from the 1920s to right till they closed and tore down the building in December of 1969. And consequently, that's why they named the new theater. The new theater was built during our centennial year, so consequently, that's why it was called the Century. And inside this display case, we have a variety of artifacts from the Savoy. We have some old films down there. We have some tickets. I don't know, you'd be able to see those. And we have some movie shorts that were used as advertisements before the movies. So for example, they would show one that said, next week the Savoy Theatre will feature, and advertisements for concessions and stuff. This right here, Don, is the actual charter from the Modern Woodsman of America. There was two parts to that. There was the Modern Woodsman of America, and the female auxiliary was called the Royal Neighbors of America. And this is the charter for the Royal Neighbors of America. And in the background is the actual incorporation seal from the club, the Modern Woodsman of America. And the stack of books there belonged to the manager of the theater. His name was Benjamin Sylvester. And he also worked for Charlie Brooks as the manager of the telephone company until he drowned. I believe he drowned in the 1950s in Eagle Lake, in St. Croix Lake, excuse me. And finally, right here on the bottom is a book of Savoy Theatre playbills. These playbills were from the 1950s and 60s. The playbills were simply advertisement of what was playing at the theater that week. And those playbills were usually distributed on Saturday and Sunday mornings at the church. So there would be young men that would go and put these all in on the windshields of the cars, and consequently would advertise the movies that were coming the next week. So we have a record of each and every movie, actually, that was shown for close to 25 years here in Fort Kent. And we also have the Savoy, but we also have some of the Fort Kent Drive-In. These posters here, Don, date from 1931. They were posters that were produced by the Savoy Theatre to advertise their movies. And you'll notice nowadays we have a movie sometimes will last a few weeks. In the 1930s, the movies changed each and every night. And all these movies, like Bela Lugosi's Dracula, the Joan Crawford Dance Fool's Dance, these were all produced in 1931. So consequently, they had a brand new Hollywood movie every night of the week here in Fort Kent, excluding Sunday. So in those early years in the 1930s, new movie every night. Sunday they were closed, but they were really, really busy. So you had the opportunities. Hollywood was here in Fort Kent. Definitely, we always, since 1917, have always had the need for cinematic arts here. And we truly became a smaller nation when we got a theater here. And this here, Don, this little cabinet here on the bottom is an original piece from the Savoy, and it's a film cabinet. And that's where they would store their films while they were after they would be rewound. Some films took up to 8 reels. So each reel, so this would be reel 1, 2, and etc. So after they were rewound, they were placed back, and then to get ready for the next day, or they were just simply replaced back in their cans and sent back. So that was a case that they used, believe it or not, until recently. It only makes the past few years that they've converted to digital. So until just a few years ago, they used this case to care for their films. So they could have a double feature. So there's 8 enough drawers for 2 movies. A moment ago, Don, we were talking about the playbills, and the donor was Mrs. Angie Charette from Cross Lake. She donated her husband Delsey's collection, and among there was his operator's license, because the original cameras or the original projectors they used at the Savoy Theatre were used with arc rods, so almost like a welder. The light was produced by these arc rods. So you had to be licensed in order to run a projector, because it was really dangerous. Film can spontaneously combust. So amazing, they never had a fire there, but you had to be licensed. So this is Delsey's license that went to 1980. So Delsey, for most of his adult life, moonlighted at the Savoy Theatre. He was their projectionist for many, many years, and he also worked at the Community Theatre, which we'll be talking about in a few moments. This photograph was commissioned in 1953 by Charlie Brooks, the owner, and it's one of the only good photographs we have of the Savoy Theatre. The Savoy Theatre was there almost 70 years, 65 years, and it was one of the most popular buildings in town. However, like I said, we have one good picture of it, unfortunately. We believe it was a vantage point, so people would stand there, either look down the street or up the street. So consequently, this is the only good photograph we have. And this was a very early commission of quite a famous photographer from Prescal, Voscar. That was one of the first few commissions he had, and we're lucky to have 3 original prints by him. One of the Savoy, one of the Fort Kent Telephone Company, and one of the Fort Kent Drive-In. And this here is a playbill just shortly before Charlie Brooks took over in the 1940s. So this is from the 1940s, and the others that we have in the display case are from the 50s and 60s. So it was pretty neat. Like there was lots of opportunity to go to the theater, and it was a popular spot. Most people. I'm not sure, but I'm sure you went on a date, or there's proposals. I've heard Linda and George Roy. She was proposed to at the Fort Kent Drive-In. It was their first date, ironically. But yeah, she got a proposal, and it was dating, and it was socialization. And like when I went there, when I was a young man in school, we went every Friday night, not really to watch the movie, but there was definitely a character that worked there, Mrs. Gilbert Ouellette, who was the owner at the time, and we affectionately called her Madame Flashlight, because she went up and down the aisles with a flashlight, and she screamed at you in French or in English, depended what came out first, and she really ran a tight ship and kept a tight rein on that theater, very tight rein. Okay, Don, these here are posters that were found in a shed right here on Highland Avenue. The shed was being remodeled, and the person, Beth Marin, who owns a little beauty salon here in town, right here on Market Street, she donated them to us. So what's really great is these were meant to be disposable. They were meant to be used 1 week and then thrown away. But because they were used as insulation, they were saved. So consequently, we have 4 from the 1950s, and those 6 previously that we just saw were found in a home that belonged to Danny Nicholas on Hall Street, which was right next door to the theater. So they used, in the 1930s, they covered their attic in insulation with Savoy movie posters. So that's why we have so many. We're really blessed, because again, these things were meant to be disposable. They were meant to be thrown out. So at that time that Mr. Brooks came into the picture, they were going on 2-week increments. So they would have 1 week on one side and 1 week on the other. And the movies went for 2 days. So Sunday and Monday was Jerry Lewis and Rockabye Baby, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and then Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday they had a matinee. So these were from the 1950s. We got pretty great movies. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Tale of Two Cities, Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, which was one of the most, the costliest film ever made at that time. And we also have the playbills here that correspond with the poster. So we see the same thing, Sunday, Monday, Jerry Lewis, song, laughs, and Technicolor, Rockabye Baby. So we had, so the customer would have gotten this on their car window on Sunday, and then we're able to see what was available to them throughout the week. So we thought that was really neat that we could take these items that, again, were meant to be thrown out and save them and preserve them. So, and we were lucky enough, we have 10 early posters of the Savoy, 10 of them. So there's a few more out there, but we have the most, we have the largest collection. So these here were donated by Beth Marin, and then the upper ones over there were donated by Danny Nicholas, the first 3, and the bottom 3 were purchased from the carpenter who did the work that many years ago, and I'm the one who donated them. The dealer that purchased them sold them back to me for cost price. So they were $10 each, but they cost $150 to frame. So, but they were worth purchasing, and like I said, they're a wonderful collection of what was available to our ancestors in town then. So the Savoy Theatre, again, went till 1969, and usually we had a monitor here. We do have a film of the tearing down of the Savoy. So it was torn down by Francis Freeman in December of 1969. And of course, they opened the Century Theatre that same year, and the Century Theatre is going to be turning 50 this year. And they've changed drastically to now it's a digital movie that's being watched. There's no film whatsoever. And now here in Fort Kent, we have 2 separate theaters. So the big, large theater was cut in 2 a couple of years ago, and now there's 2 separate theaters. And now they're available to be rented. You could watch any movie you want there. This section, Don, deals with the community theater. The community theater was started in 1939 by our parish. Our pastor at the time was Father Aimé Giguère, who was from Lewiston. And when he came up here in the early 1930s, he saw the need for a hospital here in town, definitely a maternity hospital here in town. While we did have the hospital in Eagle Lake, at times, it just wasn't close enough to us, and Father Giguère felt that a large town like we were, we needed a hospital desperately. So he started a theater in the basement of the convent building in 1939, and they ran until 1950. And they had a variety of movies, and they were able to raise, I believe it's $80,000 for the hospital at 10 cents a head. So they were able to, the reason we have the hospital is because of Hollywood. So all that money was used for the building front of the People's Benevolent Hospital, and this was some of the paraphernalia that was sent. It was the artist rendition of the hospital in order to solicit donations. So the Savoy and the community theater ran in conjunction together, and at times there was, friendly competition. When Charlie Brooks bought the theater in the 1940s, 1944, he approached the parish and he told them that he would take over the management of the community theater and take all the profits from both theaters and split them down the middle. And that's what he did. So consequently, later when he started the drive-in, the parish also received receipts from the drive-in too, although they had never made any investment. So luckily, Mr. Brooks, he was Protestant, but he saw the need for a hospital himself here in town, and so he contributed. So they worked together in order to have this big common goal. Don, something I'd like to add about the community theater is my grandmother had 4 sisters who were Franciscans, and a lot of them had told me when the theater was running, the Mother Superior and the other sisters weren't extremely pleased about it. And the reason being is that their Vespers were at 7 p.m. And their Vespers would compete with the likes of Jimmy Stewart, James Cagney, John Wayne. So the theater was directly beneath the chapel. So they said their prayers along with some of the most famous actors in America. So that's what she said she remembered mostly about the theater, is that it competed with their evening vespers. So I always thought that was a funny little anecdote to add. This last section here deals with our drive-in movie theater we had here on the Caribou Road. It was started in 1950 by Charlie Brooks from Ashland, and Mr. Brooks purchased a piece of property that previously had been used as Fort Kent's airport. So before the airport at the Fish River Falls, they had used that airport. Roland Dumas and Harry Noble would land their plane there. And in 1953, they had this portrait taken of this was the snack shack, and then the screen. And we have some additional photographs of the snack shack and then the whole layout from the 1970s. The top is a reproduction. We blew it up almost too large, but it's a copy of an actual ticket from the drive-in. And we were very happy to receive that because, again, this was meant to be thrown out. And a lady, a really good patron of the society, Polly Jackson, was cleaning out some old coats, and she found it in her coat. And she thought of me, and so that's how it ended up in our collection. And I think it's through Facebook because I advertised on Facebook we were going to do this, and so it's because of that we've gotten some really great artifacts that go along with our exhibits, so that to help interpret that story, because we love doing exhibits where there's a story component, there's a photo component, and then an actual artifact. So it's just easier to tell history than simple words on a wall. Yeah, on this side here, Don, these are Fort Kent drive-in playbills, similar to the ones of the Savoy Theatre. So they would place these, again, on the car windows. This is the theater after they put a cover on the screen. So this was in 1970. This is part of Dick Harvey's letterhead. He owned the theater from the 1970s till the 1980s, and then he sold to Clarence Levesque. And Mrs. Marilyn Harvey, who gave a lot of the artifacts in this display, and along with her husband's collection in our display we had last year on the Fort Kent Telephone Company, she told me the only time they ever made money was when they had adult films. So that was just a little. Now this gentleman here, Don, is a Mr. Daigle. He lived on Pearl Street. His name was Derek Degg, and he was the officer that worked at the theater. He was not a police officer, but he did have some authority, and he's the one who made sure that there were no stowaways and trunks, and he patrolled the theater, but patrolled the drive-in to make sure it was nice and safe.
The drive-in was built in
1950.
1950, and it was demolished in what year?
Oh boy, it was demolished after Morel Saucier purchased the property and made a garage out of it. I would dare say the mid-90s. They tore the screen down anyway. And actually part of the snack or projectionist shack is still there. It's part of the garage today. And that was the area when Valley Auto burnt down in 2012, that was reclaimed that was used temporarily as the car dealership until they built a new one. Well, Don, thank you very much for coming. This makes quite a few times you've come and photographed our exhibits. I really appreciate that. It gives a nice historical record of what we've been doing, and hopefully this year is Fort Kent's 150th birthday. So in consequence, for our sesquicentennial, we'll be having loads of exhibits here. We're going to have an exhibit on 150 years of fashion here in Fort Kent, and we're going to feature millinery stores and men's clothing stores we've had. We are going to be commemorating the centennial of the death of Father Joseph Marcoux from Eagle Lake and Wallagrass, his legacy still lives with us today. And then we're going to feature the Fort Kent Police Department We're also going to have a display on the Knights of Columbus, which they are turning 100 this year, and are pretty much fixtures and have always been fixtures in our community. And also, we're going to be featuring the Fort Kent Fire Department. So this year is going to be a really busy year. We're finally going to be honoring the first female legislator in the state of Maine. Her name was Dora Bradbury Pinkham, and she was a young lady from here in Fort Kent. So politically, she broke the glass ceiling of every single lady in the state of Maine and paved the way for people like Margaret Chase Smith and Olympia Snow. So we have her table set, which has just been recently donated to us. And we imagine her campaign was run from that table. So we're going to be putting a great display together on Mrs. Pinkham. And we're going to feature 8 highlights of her life. So that should be real fun. And it's going to be a real testament to the women, the political leaders that have come from the Valley. So thank you very much, and hope to see you this summer.